I was super excited when I took delivery of the AOC AG274QG, and I'm even more excited to be sharing my results with you, because this is arguably my favourite 1440p 240Hz IPS monitor, and arguably the best all-round monitor I've ever come across. And coming from someone who's reviewed over 200 different monitors, and furthermore would consider themselves a hardcore competitive gamer, it's pretty high praise. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Now to kick off, I do want to quickly touch upon the refresh rate of the monitor, and the reason I want to highlight this is because it runs 1440p at 240Hz, which in its first instance is going to require a lot of GPU power. So therefore, if you have an underpowered GPU, you might want to consider a 144Hz monitor or a 1080p monitor instead. Now for those people who have the GPU power but wouldn't consider themselves a hardcore competitive gamer, this 240Hz panel might be a bit lost on you. In other words, the fluidity you're going to gain is going to be somewhat redundant for potentially the games that you're playing. Equally, if you're a console gamer, 240Hz just doesn't make any sense whatsoever unless you are also a PC gamer. Now for those of us like myself who are competitive gamers and can enjoy 240Hz or above at 1440p, you'll be pleased to know that this monitor is absolutely spectacular. Now, in terms of its input lag, I will say it's class leading. I had no issues whatsoever registering my inputs, and furthermore, I was even able to measure it. Now this leads me on to the Nvidia Reflex tool that comes built in with the AG274QG. Now the Reflex tool by Nvidia allows you to monitor the total system lag and even in terms of how the monitor's lag is. Now this will be a useful tool for those people who are interested about the numbers, but aside from this, it's not really going to show or indeed change anything within your setup. So other than the Nvidia Reflex tool giving you some sort of insight about the overall latency of your monitor, I don't really quite see the point of Nvidia's tool, but nevertheless it is present in this AOC monitor, and the reason I want to reference it is because it goes hand in hand with the overall input lag of the monitor, which hopefully you can take my opinion on board and therefore trust me to say that this monitor is fantastic when it comes to input lag, so much so that I can see myself playing hardcore competitive games with it. But what about its response time? Well, here, very much like the Alienware AW2721D, the monitor, in other words the AOC AG274QG, also has a little bit of inverse ghosting in its highest overdrive mode. Now it will be noticeable in a more graphically intense game such as Destiny 2, Halo Infinite or Valorant, but in a potato looking game such as Counter-Strike it might not be as immediately apparent. Nevertheless, even in its highest mode overdrive, I did think that it was throwing off my shots a little bit. So much so that I just felt that the highest overdrive mode just didn't quite work well with my eyes, and as a result I threw it down to the medium overdrive mode. Now here, naturally, you will think that the overall response time of the monitor has significantly dropped, and in most cases I would say that given this is the case with the monitor, that it wouldn't be suitable for competitive gaming. But that's anything further but the truth with this AOC monitor, because even in its medium overdrive setting, the monitor's response time is still seriously impressive, so much so that I didn't have any problems when it came to the overall response time of the monitor, and yet I incurred very little inverse ghosting in comparison to the strongest overdrive mode. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is that if your eyes can take it and you want the fastest response time of the monitor, of course dial it on its strongest mode. If, however, you're like myself and you would like a little bit more of a blend between the two, in other words from inverse ghosting and the response time, you want to dial it down one notch to the medium overdrive mode and here experience a slightly more visually appealing game. Now aside from hardcore competitive gaming, this monitor also does excel across other features that it offers. And first off, let's talk about Nvidia G-Sync / AMD FreeSync. Now if you have got an appropriate graphics card, you'll be able to benefit from the full VRR range, which is 1 to 240Hz, which isn't the same that could be said about the Samsung Odyssey G7 that does not have a built-in G-Sync module. So indeed here you can enjoy 1440p at 240Hz while running G-Sync, and I had no issues whatsoever with my RTX 2080 Super. Better still, I was able to run HDR simultaneously with this setup, and as a result when when I was playing Destiny 2, I was having a tear-free gaming experience while also utilizing 1440p at 240Hz, and the resulting outcome was fantastic. Now, while playing Destiny 2, I was also able to enjoy HDR, and by that I mean that this monitor is not limited to HDR 400 and indeed has got the HDR 600 certification. I noted a peak brightness of over 700 nits, which definitely does classify this monitor as a very bright monitor, of course where needed, and as a result when it comes to HDR gaming, it was an absolute pleasure. Furthermore, I was able to run HDR simultaneously with Nvidia G-Sync and 1440p and 240Hz, which meant that the overall package that I was getting while playing an HDR enabled game such as Destiny 2 was fantastic. Now, on that note, the monitor has 32 local dimming zones, very much like the Alienware AW2721D, and indeed does not have full array local dimming. Now, in this case, the monitor has got a few different settings: gaming, hybrid, and desktop. Now, the gaming mode is probably the one that you're going to want to select if you are indeed consuming any sort of game content, because the quick change of scenes will need to be quite responsive on the variable backlight, and as a result will give you the best experience. If, however, you're consuming a little bit more slower content, you might want to go on the hybrid or desktop modes instead. But you can play around with this through the OSD, which I'll showcase further down in this review. Now, I should also mention that the variable backlight is also present in SDR and HDR, which is great to see. So to round off the gaming section, I should also touch upon console gamers, and as I did mention at the beginning of this review, you should only consider this monitor if you are a hardcore competitive PC gamer, but you also have a console as well. Now, in this respect, an Xbox will run at 120Hz at 1440p, and while if you're on Xbox or PlayStation, you'll be able to run full HD at 120Hz only. Now, note here, the monitor, very much like the Alienware AW2721D, does not accept a 4K signal input. And here, the Samsung Odyssey G7 has a step up over its two competitors, whereby a 4K simulated 4K can be outputted via a PlayStation or Xbox, and therefore might make it a better pick for those people who also have a console and also would consider themselves a hardcore PC gamer. So his gaming credentials are pretty impressive, but what about when it comes to image quality? Well, here, in my opinion, is one of the key selling points of the AOC AG274QG, because here it has an sRGB emulation mode, which means that it has got pinpoint sRGB color accuracy. So much so that when I put it across my Datacolor SpiderX Elite, I noted a whopping 97.9% sRGB gamut coverage and a bang on 100% gamut volume, which is something I haven't noted in a gaming monitor for a very long time, and that's seriously impressive. As for color accuracy, average delta E sits at 1.05 and a maximum of 1.97 delta E, making it a feasible monitor for hardcore competitive gamers alike and those of us who also do image editing or video grading. Now, as for its contrast ratio, the 27-inch IPS panel will not compete with a curved or flat VA panel, and indeed here I measured a 1027:1 contrast ratio while using my Calibrite CC Display Plus calibrator. Suffice to say, if contrast ratio is something of a top priority and or you play a lot of dark games or watch a lot of dark movies, then arguably here a VA panel will be a better pick over an IPS panel. Similarly, an IPS panel will not compete with its VA counterpart when it comes to overall backlight bleed, and indeed every IPS monitor suffers from somewhat of a little bit of glow, but in my case with the tested panel I had no problems whatsoever. Of course, I appreciate this is panel lottery, and so is the overall brightness uniformity, whereby on my panel it was stupendously good, so much so I had no problems whatsoever when it came to image editing, and when I was using the 4 separate corners of the monitor I didn't notice an overall shift in terms of the overall brightness. Speaking of which, when it comes to brightness, the monitor reaches 725 nits in HDR, and in SDR and including the sRGB emulation mode, you can still reach 478 nits, and as for minimum you get around 45 nits. Now, what I really love over here, and while it might be a small point and potentially a niche for certain people, is that you can edit images, pinpoint accurately in sRGB mode, and still have a peak brightness of 478 nits, which isn't the same that could be said about a lot of other monitors out there on the market, which basically cap peak brightness in sRGB mode to around 120 nits. So moving on to the monitor's OSD, it can be accessed through a joystick button found behind the monitor or via the included puck. And the included puck also has a red LED light that surrounds it, and if you go through the game settings in the OSD, you can disable this if you so wish via the quick switch LED option. Now here you'll be able to adjust the overdrive modes that I previously referenced, and you'll want to run on strong or medium depending on how you feel with it. Now as for luminance, I really love the fact that AOC have integrated a nit difference. In other words, it's not a percentage difference, and therefore gives you a good accurate reproduction as to what level in terms of brightness that it's running on. Now through this menu you can also see a few different settings. First off, in terms of the SDR sRGB, it's the emulation mode which you want to enable or disable. Now in my case I leave it enabled, but if you want to have a little bit more saturated or punchy colors, you might want to disable it, and of course this will affect the overall sRGB color accuracy, so something to be mindful about. Now as for the SDR variable backlight, I did reference it before, you can enable it over here, and then you'll have option to go between the gaming, hybrid and desktop modes in terms of the backlight mode, which is quite handy. I would suggest the gaming mode, but of course you can play around with it to see what you prefer, and of course fully disable it. Similarly, you'll have the same sort of options when you have the HDR signal through it, and therefore that option is currently grayed out because we're running on an SDR signal. Now as for auto brightness and auto black level, I would leave these disabled, and as for max brightness, I would leave it enabled. Now a little note, when you do enable max brightness for the first time, it will skew around with all your OSD settings, so it's potentially the first setting you'll want to adjust before tinker around with the OSD. Now as for the G-Sync processor, you've got deep sleep and USB charge, which are in reference to the USB Type A ports which are found underneath the monitor, and then you've got access to the Nvidia Reflex analyzer tool, which you can enable or disable and of course customize to make sure you're monitoring it properly. As I did mention before, it's not something that I would personally use, so I leave it disabled, but of course you can play around it with your heart's content. Now as for the color setup, here you have got the color temperatures that you can choose from. It's nice to see you've got a user mode with RGB values that you can adjust, but I think most people will leave it on warm and not have to touch it. Similarly, when it comes to 6-axis color, it does allow you a wide degree of customization, but yet again I suspect most people won't want to touch it. Now as for audio, the monitor has two 5-watt speakers with DTS sound. I would definitely suggest enabling DTS sound if you want the most accurate and more punchy sort of audio quality, but nevertheless here I would always suggest a set of bookshelf speakers and or a set of headphones with a DAC, because you'll get far superior audio quality. Now as for light effects, there are some built-in RGB lights at the rear of the monitor. They're nowhere near in terms of comparison of Philips Ambiglow effect, but nevertheless are there for you to customize. And here through the OSD you can enable it in terms of 3 brightness modes. So for example on strong, you can choose the different mode that you want. So for example, let's go on breathing, and then you've got the patterns which you can also choose, where you can also have user define, where you can adjust the RGB values. Yet again, it's something that I don't use, so I leave this fully disabled. Similarly, when it comes to the logo projection, it sits underneath the monitor. This yet again provides a little bit of customization whereby you can adjust the RGB values and change the color of the Agon or the AOC logo. Yet again, I don't really see the point of it, so I completely leave this disabled. And through the extra menu you can also see what refresh rate and resolution the monitor is running on, which can be quite handy. Finally, in terms of OSD setup, it's pretty self-explanatory, and you might want to adjust the overall transparency. Now while its OSD is very comprehensive, what about when it comes to build quality and the stand? Now first off, on the former, the monitor has a 3-side borderless design. It's almost 4-side borderless because the bottom bezel is extremely thin, and it's definitely appreciated because it takes up less space on your desk. Now, if you do want to use the shader hoods which come included, you can do so as well. This means that it might be a little bit less distracting if you're a hardcore gamer and or a photo editor, but in my case I quite like the background tones that I have on my desk, and as a result I don't actually use them. Now as for the stand, this is arguably its biggest flaw, at least in my opinion. It's really large and elongated, so much so that it sticks out from my IKEA threaded desk, and I suspect many people who want to run this monitor, be it on a monitor riser or even on a flat desk setup, will find that the monitor's stand legs are just too big. It just doesn't fit with the rest of the overall sleek and slender design of this monitor, and as a result means that you'll probably want to replace it via a VESA compatible stand on a monitor arm. And so this brings me onto my verdict, and here the AOC AG274QG is indeed my favorite gaming monitor that I've reviewed to date, and as a result gets my Best Buy award. Now you might have noticed that throughout this review I haven't actually referenced its price, and that's because I don't have it at hand, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I'm the first person in the world to actually review this monitor, which is a great honour. However, when it comes to a reviewing point of view, it can make it a little bit hard when it comes to different recommendations. Nevertheless, if we preempt it and say that the AOC monitor will come in at a significantly steeper price, you might want to consider the Alienware AW2721D instead, because it doesn't have the shader hood, the sRGB color accuracy or the emulation mode, and of course doesn't have the Nvidia Reflex analyzer tool, but is otherwise a fantastic alternative. Similarly, the Samsung Odyssey G7 would be my top pick if you want a curved VA 1440p 240Hz monitor. I, like you, I am a consumer, and as a result I have to recommend the monitors that I can afford and or give you the best bang for buck. So hopefully AOC's pricing comes in competitively, so much so that it might even knock out the Alienware and Samsung altogether. But I'll have to see what comes of it, and of course I'll be intrigued to see your thoughts of the monitor down in the comment section below, regardless of the price. Now if you've enjoyed this detailed, independent, honest review, definitely do drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which will be greatly appreciated. And as such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.